Long before the thistles bloomed on a unified standard, the land we now know as Scotland was a tapestry of ancient whispers and shifting mists, a rugged northern edge of an island where the very stones seemed to hold forgotten stories. Our journey begins in the early centuries AD, a time when the Roman Empire, at its zenith, cast its long shadow but ultimately recoiled from the wild, untamed territories north of Hadrian's Wall. Here, in the land the Romans called Caledonia, lived a people shrouded in a certain mystique, the Picts. Their name, derived from the Latin picti, meaning painted ones, hints at their vibrant body art, a practice that must have presented a striking, even formidable sight to any encroaching legions. Imagine a landscape where dense forests clung to steep hillsides, where lochs lay still and dark beneath brooding skies, and where communities carved out their existence with resilience and ingenuity. The Picts were not a single monolithic entity, but rather a confederation of tribes, their territories stretching across what is now eastern and northern Scotland. Their legacy is etched not just in Roman accounts, but in the enduring mystery of their exquisitely carved symbol stones, monuments that stand as silent sentinels across the Scottish landscape. These stones, often found near ancient settlements or burial sites, depict a fascinating array of animals, abstract symbols, and sometimes even human figures, all rendered with a distinctive artistic flair. What these symbols truly meant, however, remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Were they clan emblems, territorial markers, religious iconography, or perhaps a sophisticated form of proto-writing? The truth is, we may never fully decode their secrets, and their silent beauty continues to invite endless speculation, a testament to a culture that communicated in ways we are still striving to understand. Around the same time, or perhaps even earlier, another distinct people began to settle in the western reaches of this land, the Gaels. Originating from Ireland, they brought with them a rich oral tradition, a sophisticated legal system, and the Gaelic language, which would eventually become one of the foundational tongues of Scotland. Their kingdom, Dal Riata, emerged in the early 6th century, bridging the narrow sea between northeastern Ireland and what is now Argyll in Scotland. This was not a sudden invasion, but a gradual process of migration, settlement, and cultural exchange. The Gaels, unlike the Picts, were literate, and their monastic traditions would eventually give us some of the earliest written records of the region, offering invaluable glimpses into this formative period. The relationship between the Picts and the Gaels was complex, a shifting mosaic of conflict, alliance, and cultural intermingling. For centuries, these two dominant groups, along with smaller populations of Britons in the south and Angles in the southeast, vied for supremacy, their territories ebbing and flowing like the tides. Battles were fought over fertile lands, strategic strongholds, and political dominance. Yet, there was also a shared cultural heritage, particularly in their art and early Christian practices. The arrival of Christianity, often attributed to figures like Saint Columba, who established his monastery on Iona in 563 AD, began to weave a new thread into the fabric of these societies. Iona became a beacon of learning and religious devotion, its influence radiating outwards, slowly transforming the spiritual landscape of both Pictish and Gaelic realms. The 9th century, however, brought a new and formidable force to the shores of northern Britain, the Vikings. These Norse raiders and settlers, with their longships and fierce reputations, began to exert immense pressure on the existing kingdoms. They plundered monasteries, seized coastal territories, and established their own settlements, particularly in the northern islands and along the Western Sea. Aboard, this external threat, paradoxically, may have played a crucial role in forging a more unified identity among the disparate peoples of Caledonia. Faced with a common enemy, the need for a stronger, more centralized power became increasingly apparent. It is against this backdrop of Viking incursions and internal strife that the figure of Kenneth MacAlpin emerges, a name often invoked as the father of the Scottish nation. The traditional narrative, perhaps embellished over centuries, speaks of Kenneth, a king of Dal Riata, inheriting the Pictish throne around 843 AD. This unification, often portrayed as a decisive conquest, was likely a far more gradual and intricate process, a political maneuvering through dynastic marriages, strategic alliances, and perhaps even military victories. The exact mechanisms of how Kenneth MacAlpin, or Sinead MacAlpin as he was known in Gaelic, came to rule both Picts and Gaels remain a point of scholarly contention. Some historians suggest a slow integration, while others point to a more direct seizure of power, possibly after a period of Pictish weakness following Viking attacks or internal disputes. What is clear, however, is that his reign marked a pivotal moment, the merging of the Pictish and Gaelic royal lines, laying the foundation for a new kingdom. This nascent kingdom, initially known as Alba, began to consolidate its power, slowly but surely absorbing the remaining Pictish territories. The Pictish language, a mystery to us now, gradually faded, replaced by Gaelic, which became the dominant language of the new kingdom. Pictish artistic traditions, however, endured for a time, blending with Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon influences to create a unique early Scottish style. The capital of this new realm was often centred around Scone, a place steeped in ancient ceremony and tradition, where kings were inaugurated upon the legendary stone of Scone, a symbol of royal authority. The kings who followed Kenneth MacAlpin continued the work of nation-building. They faced ongoing challenges from the Vikings, who continued to hold sway in the north and west, and from the Anglo-Saxons to the south, particularly the powerful kingdom of Northumbria. The borders of Alba were fluid, constantly shifting as territories were gained and lost. Yet, through these struggles, a distinct Scottish identity began to coalesce. The term Scotus, or Scots, originally referring to the Gaels, gradually expanded to encompass all the inhabitants of Alba, regardless of their ancestral origins. One of the lesser-known details of this period is the role of the Caeli D, or Clients of God, a monastic reform movement that emerged in Ireland and spread to Scotland in the 8th and 9th centuries. These ascetic monks emphasized personal piety, strict discipline, and a return to simpler Christian values. Their influence, though often subtle, helped to shape the religious and intellectual landscape of early Alba, contributing to the development of a distinct Scottish ecclesiastical tradition that would later play a significant role in the kingdom's political and social life. Their quiet devotion and scholarly pursuits provided a bedrock of continuity and learning amidst the turbulent political changes. The 10th and 11th centuries saw the further expansion and consolidation of Alba. Kings like Mael Colum I and Sinead II pushed the kingdom's boundaries southwards, gradually incorporating the lands of Strathclyde, a British kingdom, and even parts of Northumbria. The Battle of Carham in 1018, though its details are somewhat obscure, is often cited as a crucial victory that secured the Tweed-Solway line as the southern border of what was by then increasingly being referred to as Scotland. This slow, often brutal, process of territorial expansion and political integration was not without its internal conflicts and dynastic struggles, but each challenge, each victory, each setback served to forge a stronger, more unified kingdom. The kings of Alba, through their strategic marriages, military campaigns, and shrewd diplomacy, laid the groundwork for the medieval Scottish kingdom. They established a system of governance, developed a legal framework, and fostered a sense of shared heritage among their diverse subjects. The transition from a collection of disparate tribes to a recognizable nation was a long and arduous journey, spanning centuries. It was a story told not just in the annals of kings, but in the everyday lives of farmers tilling the soil, artisans crafting their wares, and monks illuminating manuscripts. The legacy of the Picts, the resilience of the Gaels, the influence of the Britons, and the challenges posed by the Vikings and Angles all contributed to the unique crucible from which Scotland emerged. The mists of time may obscure many of the finer details, but the broad strokes of this foundational era paint a vivid picture of a land and a people slowly, deliberately forging their own destiny. From the enigmatic symbols on ancient stones to the sagas whispered around flickering hearths, the story of Alba is the story of Scotland's birth, a testament to the enduring power of identity and nationhood. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The mists of time, ever shifting, now thin to reveal a figure emerging from the shadows of the 11th century. Mael Colin Mac Don Carder, or Malcolm III, known to history as Malcolm Canmore, Great Chief. His ascent to the throne in 1058 after a protracted struggle against Macbeth marked not just a change in ruler, but the beginning of a profound transformation that would reshape the very fabric of Alba. His reign, lasting nearly 5 decades, would lay the groundwork for a Scotland that, while still distinct, began to look increasingly like its southern neighbour. Malcolm Canmore was a man forged in exile, having spent years at the English court of Edward the Confessor. This period of his life, though often overshadowed by his later exploits, was crucial. It exposed him to Norman customs, administrative practices, and a more structured, feudal way of governance that was slowly taking root in England even before the conquest of 1066. When he returned to claim his birthright, he brought with him not just an army, but an understanding of a different kind of kingship. His marriage to Margaret, an English princess of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, was a pivotal moment. Margaret, later canonized as Saint Margaret, was a devout and cultured woman who had also spent time at the English court. She brought with her a retinue of English and Norman advisors, clerics, and artisans, and a deep commitment to reforming the Scottish Church along continental lines. Before her arrival, the Scottish Church, while Christian, retained many Celtic traditions, including a looser organizational structure and a different Easter calculation. Margaret tirelessly championed Roman rites, the establishment of dioceses, and the introduction of monastic orders like the Benedictines. She founded churches, encouraged learning, and was renowned for her charity, particularly towards the poor and orphans. Her influence was immense, not just spiritually, but culturally, as she introduced more sophisticated courtly manners and a taste for finer goods. The very language of the court began to shift, with English becoming more prevalent alongside Gaelic. This process of Normanization, though initially subtle, accelerated significantly under Malcolm and Margaret's sons. Their children bore names like Edgar, Alexander, and David, names that resonated with English and Norman royalty rather than the traditional Gaelic lineage. This naming convention itself was a quiet declaration of a new cultural alignment. It was during the reigns of these sons, particularly David I, 1124 to 1153, that the feudal system, as understood in England and continental Europe, truly began to take root in Scotland. Feudalism, in its essence, was a system of land tenure and military service. The king, at the apex, granted large tracts of land, fiefs, to his loyal followers, typically Norman or Anglo-Norman knights, in exchange for their military service, counsel, and loyalty. These tenants-in-chief, or barons, in turn, subdivided their lands among lesser knights, creating a hierarchical pyramid of allegiance. This was a stark contrast to the existing Gaelic system, which was based more on kinship, tribal loyalties, and the payment of tribute rather than formal land grants tied to military obligation. The introduction of feudalism brought with it a new class of powerful landowners, often speaking French or English, who owed their allegiance directly to the Scottish king. They built stone castles, symbols of their power and the king's authority, across the landscape. Replacing the older, less permanent timber strongholds, these castles, like Edinburgh, Stirling, and Roxburgh, became administrative centres, military garrisons, and focal points of local power, gradually altering the very geography of the kingdom. The arrival of these Norman and Anglo-Norman families, names like Bruce, Stewart, Comyn, and Fraser, was not always peaceful. There were tensions, sometimes outright rebellions, from the older Gaelic aristocracy who saw their traditional power and customs being eroded. Yet the kings, particularly David I, actively encouraged their settlement, recognizing their military prowess, administrative skills, and their loyalty, which often surpassed that of the more independent-minded Gaelic chiefs. David I, often called the Saint by later chroniclers for his piety, was also a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, keenly aware of the need to strengthen his kingdom and centralize royal authority. He had spent his youth at the English court, a favored nephew of Henry I, and was deeply immersed in Anglo-Norman culture. The establishment of burghs was another transformative aspect of this era. Burghs were chartered towns, granted special privileges by the king, often in exchange for an annual payment. They were typically founded near royal castles or monasteries, strategically placed to encourage trade and economic growth. These towns were populated by merchants and craftsmen, many of whom were Flemings, English, or Germans, attracted by the opportunities Scotland offered. They were granted rights to self-governance, to hold markets, and to trade freely, creating centres of commerce and urban life that were largely absent in pre-Norman Scotland. The first royal burghs, such as Berwick, Roxburgh, Stirling, and Edinburgh, became vital economic hubs, facilitating the export of raw materials like wool, hides, and fish, and the import of manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items. The burghs introduced a money economy more widely, slowly displacing the older system of bartering and payments in kind. They also served as centres for royal administration and justice, further solidifying the king's reach across his kingdom. The very architecture of these burghs, with their planned streets, market crosses, and stone buildings, reflected a new, more ordered vision for Scotland. The church, too, continued its profound transformation under the Canmore Dynasty. Following Margaret's initial reforms, her sons, especially David I, became enthusiastic patrons of monasticism and the Roman church structure. David founded numerous monasteries, including Melrose, Holyrood, and Jedburgh, inviting orders like the Cistercians, Augustinians, and Tyrannensians to establish houses in Scotland. These monasteries were not just centres of spiritual life, they were also agricultural innovators, clearing land, introducing new farming techniques and becoming significant economic players. They were also centers of learning, preserving texts, copying manuscripts, and educating future generations of clerics and administrators. The establishment of a structured diocesan system with bishops overseeing specific territories further integrated Scotland into the wider European Christian world. Bishops became powerful figures, often acting as royal advisors and administrators, bridging the gap between spiritual and temporal authority. The Church provided a common legal framework, a system of education, and a shared cultural identity that transcended regional differences. It also provided a vital diplomatic link to the continent, connecting Scotland to the broader currents of European thought and politics. However, this process of Normanization and the adoption of feudal structures was not a complete or immediate overhaul. Scotland was not simply a blank slate upon which new systems were imposed. The older Gaelic traditions and social structures persisted, particularly in the Highlands and the West. The kings, while embracing new ways, also had to navigate and integrate with the existing power structures. Gaelic law and custom continued to be practiced in many areas, and the Gaelic language remained the dominant tongue for a significant portion of the population. This created a fascinating dual identity for the Scottish kingdom: a lowland Scotland increasingly aligned with Anglo-Norman culture, and a Highland Scotland that retained its distinct Gaelic character. The kings of the Canmore line often found themselves balancing these two worlds, sometimes successfully, sometimes with difficulty. For instance, while David I encouraged Norman settlement, he also recognized the importance of the older Gaelic earldoms, often confirming their traditional rights and integrating them into his administration. One lesser-known detail from this period is the role of the king's mormers. Before the full adoption of feudal earldoms, the traditional Gaelic rulers of regions were known as mormers. These were powerful regional lords, often with ancient lineage, who held sway over vast territories. Malcolm Canmore and his successors gradually transformed these mormers into feudal earls, but the process was complex and often involved a delicate negotiation of power. In some cases, the Gaelic mormers were replaced by Norman appointees, but in others, the existing Gaelic families adopted the new feudal titles and practices, blending the old with the new. This shows a pragmatic approach by the Scottish kings, adapting rather than entirely eradicating the existing system. The exact nature and extent of feudalism in Scotland compared to England remains a subject of scholarly debate. Historians still disagree whether Scotland adopted a classic feudal system or a more modified version that incorporated elements of its Gaelic past. Some argue that Scottish feudalism was never as rigorously applied or as uniformly structured as its English counterpart, particularly regarding military service and land tenure. The concept of kinship and clan loyalty, for instance, continued to play a much stronger role in Scotland than in England, even within the feudal framework. Others contend that while there were regional variations, the core principles of feudal land tenure and military obligation were firmly established by the 12th century, particularly in the lowlands. This debate highlights the unique hybrid nature of medieval Scottish society, a blend of indigenous traditions and imported innovations. The legacy of the Canmore Dynasty, particularly Malcolm III and David I, was profound. They laid the foundations for a centralized monarchy, a more structured legal system, and an economy increasingly integrated with Europe. They introduced a new aristocracy, built castles, founded burghs, and reformed the church, all of which contributed to the emergence of a distinct Scottish kingdom, albeit one heavily influenced by its southern neighbour. The seeds of future conflicts, particularly with England, were also sown during this period, as the Scottish kings, through their feudal ties and territorial ambitions, became increasingly entangled in English politics. Yet, for a time, this era was one of remarkable growth and transformation, shaping the contours of a nation that was slowly but surely finding its place on the medieval map. The winds of change swept through Alba, carrying with them new ideas, new people, and a new vision for the future, leaving an indelible mark on the land and its people. The whispers of a new dawn stirred across the Scottish landscape as the 12th century unfurled its tapestry, and with it came a figure whose shadow would stretch long over the land, David I. Born into the royal house of Canmore, the youngest son of Malcolm III and St. Margaret, David's early life was steeped in an Anglo-Norman world, a stark contrast to the more Gaelic traditions of his elder brothers. He spent his formative years at the English court of his brother-in-law, Henry I, where he absorbed the sophisticated administrative practices, legal structures, and feudal customs that were reshaping England. This period, from roughly 1100 to 1124, was not merely an exile, but an education, a strategic immersion in the very systems he would later transplant and adapt to his northern kingdom. When David ascended to the Scottish throne in 1124, after the reigns of his brothers Edgar and Alexander I, he brought with him not just a crown, but a vision. His reign, lasting until 1153, is often hailed as a transformative era, a period of profound modernization that laid many of the foundations for the Scottish kingdom as we know it. He inherited a realm that, while unified, still retained a patchwork of ancient laws, customs, and local powers. David's genius lay in his ability to selectively adopt and adapt foreign institutions, grafting them onto the existing Scottish framework rather than simply imposing them. One of the most significant changes David introduced was the widespread adoption of feudalism, a system that had already taken firm root in England and much of continental Europe. He granted large tracts of land to Norman, Anglo-Norman, and Flemish knights and nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. These new landholders, such as the Bruces, the Stewarts, and the Comyns, became the bedrock of a new aristocracy, bringing with them not only their martial prowess, but also their administrative expertise. They built castles, established new towns, and introduced more efficient agricultural practices. This wasn't a hostile takeover, but a strategic invitation designed to strengthen the Crown's authority and to provide a loyal, professional fighting force. The landscape itself began to change, with motte and bailey castles, previously rare, now dotting the hillsides, symbols of a new order and a centralized power. Alongside feudalism came a profound restructuring of the legal system. David established royal burghs, chartered towns that enjoyed special privileges and protection, often governed by royal officials. These burghs, such as Roxburgh, Berwick, Stirling, and Edinburgh, became centres of trade and commerce, generating wealth for the Crown and fostering a nascent urban culture. They operated under a distinct set of laws, often based on English or continental models, and provided a counterweight to the power of the landed aristocracy. He also introduced sheriffs, royal officials responsible for administering justice and collecting taxes in specific regions, thereby extending the reach of royal law beyond the immediate domain lands. This move began to standardize justice across the kingdom, slowly eroding the fragmented, localized legal systems that had previously prevailed. The flourishing of monasticism was another hallmark of David's reign. A deeply pious man, influenced by his mother's devotion, David was a prolific founder of monasteries, endowing them with vast lands and resources. He established Cistercian abbeys like Melrose, Newbattle, and Kinloss, and Augustinian priories such as Holyrood and Jedburgh. These monasteries were not merely centres of prayer and contemplation, they were also hubs of learning, agriculture, and economic activity. Monks brought with them advanced farming techniques, architectural skills, and literacy, contributing significantly to the cultural and economic development of the kingdom. They also served as royal administrators and diplomats, further integrating Scotland into the broader European Christian world. The very stones of these grand abbeys, now often in ruins, still whisper of the intellectual and spiritual fervour of David's age. Yet, David's reign was not without its complexities, particularly concerning his relationship with England. His years at the English court had forged strong personal bonds, but his ambition for Scotland and his claim to the earldom of Huntingdon, inherited through his wife, Maud of Huntingdon, often put him at odds with his English counterparts. The death of Henry I in 1135 plunged England into a brutal civil war, known as the Anarchy, as Stephen of Blois and Empress Matilda, Henry I's daughter and David's niece, vied for the throne. David, a staunch supporter of Matilda, saw an opportunity to press his own claims and expand Scottish territory. He launched several invasions into northern England, famously leading his armies as far south as Yorkshire. His motivations were multifaceted: loyalty to his niece, a desire to secure the Anglo-Scottish border, and perhaps a genuine belief in his own right to rule parts of northern England. The most famous engagement was the Battle of the Standard in 1138, near Northallerton, where the Scottish forces, despite their numerical superiority, suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of the English. This battle, named for the English practice of carrying a standard bearing the consecrated host and banners of saints into battle, was a significant setback for David's territorial ambitions. However, David was a shrewd diplomat as well as a warrior. Despite the military defeat, he managed to negotiate favourable terms, securing control over Northumberland and Cumberland for his son Henry, though these gains would prove temporary. This constant push and pull, the intricate dance between alliance and aggression, would define Anglo-Scottish relations for centuries to come, a legacy that David I's reign indelibly shaped. Historians still debate the true extent of David's long-term territorial ambitions in England. Was he genuinely seeking to annex these northern counties permanently, or was he primarily concerned with securing a buffer zone and leveraging his position to strengthen Scotland's independent standing? The answer likely lies in a complex blend of both, reflecting the fluid political landscape of the era. A lesser-known detail from David's reign concerns his efforts to standardise the Scottish coinage. Before his time, foreign coins were widely used, and the quality of any native coinage was inconsistent. David established royal mints, primarily at Roxburgh and Berwick, producing silver pennies that bore his image and the royal cross. This was not merely an economic reform. It was a powerful statement of sovereignty, a tangible symbol of a unified kingdom under a single monarch. These small, often crude coins circulated throughout his realm, a testament to the growing economic and administrative sophistication of Scotland. Imagine the feel of these newly minted coins in the hands of a merchant in a bustling burg, a physical connection to the distant king. David's reforms were not always met with universal approval. The introduction of Norman lords and feudal customs sometimes clashed with established Gaelic traditions and clan structures, particularly in the more remote regions of the Highlands and Islands. The transition was gradual, often involving a delicate balance of coercion and conciliation. Yet, his legacy is undeniable. He transformed Scotland from a collection of disparate lordships into a more cohesive, centralized kingdom with a recognizable administration, a legal framework, and a burgeoning economy. He effectively brought Scotland into the mainstream of European medieval civilization, paving the way for future Scottish monarchs to assert their independence and build a distinct national identity. His reign also saw the beginnings of a shift in the language of power. While Gaelic remained the language of tea, key majority, particularly in the west and north, the influence of Anglo-Norman French and Latin grew significantly at court, in legal documents, and within the church. This linguistic shift, subtle at first, would gradually reshape the cultural landscape of Scotland, contributing to the eventual emergence of Scots as a distinct language. When David I died in 1153, he left behind a kingdom significantly stronger and more organized than the one he had inherited. His grandson, Malcolm IV, inherited a realm with established institutions, a more defined legal system, and a clearer sense of its place within the broader European political order. The seeds of future conflicts were certainly sown during his reign, particularly in the ongoing struggle with England, but so too were the seeds of Scottish nationhood. His reign is a testament to the power of deliberate, strategic reform, a period when a king, schooled in foreign ways, returned home to sculpt a new future for his people, forever altering the course of Scottish history. The echoes of his administrative prowess and his deep piety resonated through the cloisters of his abbeys and the stone walls of his castles for centuries to come, shaping the very soul of the land. The gentle hand of David I, which had shaped so much of Scotland's nascent kingdom, finally released its grasp in 1153. His passing, after a reign of nearly 3 decades, might have plunged the land into the kind of chaos that often followed the death of a strong monarch. Yet, a period of relative stability and even prosperity unfolded, a testament to the foundations he had laid and the enduring strength of the Scottish spirit. His grandson, Malcolm IV, known as the Maiden for his delicate health and perhaps his piety, inherited the throne. He was a young man, barely a teenager, and his reign was marked by efforts to secure the borders and navigate the complex relationship with England, a constant dance of diplomacy and occasional skirmish. He ceded some territories in the south to Henry II of England, a pragmatic move to ensure peace, though not one universally popular among his more bellicose nobles. Malcolm's reign was brief, ending in 1165. It was his younger brother, William I, who would truly usher in what many historians consider a golden age for medieval Scotland. William, known as the Lion, not for his ferocity, but for the rampant lion that became his personal emblem and subsequently the royal standard of Scotland, ruled for an astonishing 49 years, a reign almost as long as David I's. His early years were fraught with the same English entanglements that had plagued his brother. In a daring but ultimately disastrous move, in 1174, William invaded Northumberland, hoping to reclaim territories he believed were rightfully his. He was captured near Alnwick, a humiliating defeat that led to the Treaty of Falaise. This treaty, signed later that year, effectively made Scotland a feudal dependency of England, with William acknowledging Henry II as his overlord. It was a bitter pill for a proud king to swallow, and the Scottish crown was forced to pay a substantial ransom for William's release. However, the wheel of fortune turned. In 1189, Richard I, Henry II's successor, desperately needed funds to finance his crusade to the Holy Land. In a stroke of political genius, or perhaps desperation, Richard agreed to annul the Treaty of Falaise in exchange for a hefty sum of 10,000 silver marks. This agreement, known as the Quitclaim of Canterbury, restored Scotland's independence and William's sovereignty. It was a pivotal moment, freeing Scotland from the direct feudal overlordship of England and allowing William to consolidate his power further. With this renewed independence, William the Lion set about strengthening the Scottish monarchy. He continued David I's policy of fostering burghs, those burgeoning towns that served as centres of trade and royal administration. Many of Scotland's most enduring towns, from Perth to Stirling, saw significant growth and received royal charters during his reign, granting them privileges and fostering economic development. These burghs became crucial for the Scottish economy, facilitating trade with continental Europe, particularly Flanders and the Baltic states, exchanging wool, hides, and fish for wine, cloth, and luxury goods. The sight of bustling market squares, with merchants haggling in a cacophony of languages, would have been a common one in these growing urban centres. William also worked tirelessly to extend royal authority throughout the kingdom, often through force. He faced numerous rebellions, particularly in the wilder northern regions of Moray and Ross, where Gaelic traditions and clan loyalties often clashed with the centralising tendencies of the Anglo-Norman-influenced monarchy. Yet he persevered, slowly but surely weaving the disparate threads of Scotland into a more cohesive tapestry. He built and strengthened castles, symbols of royal power, and established a more effective system of justice, sending royal sheriffs to enforce the king's law across the land. It was a slow, deliberate process. But by the end of his long reign, the Scottish monarchy was undead, nearly stronger and more centralised than ever before. His marriage to Ermengarde de Beaumont, a cousin of the English king, further cemented diplomatic ties, though it did not entirely eliminate the underlying tensions. Their son, Alexander II, ascended the throne in 1214, inheriting a kingdom that was, by and large, at peace and growing in prosperity. Alexander II, like his father, was a strong and capable ruler. He continued the process of consolidating royal power, particularly in the West, where the semi-independent lordship of the Isles, a powerful Gaelic Norse entity, often challenged royal authority. He launched several campaigns against these Western lords, slowly bringing them under the Scottish crown's dominion. One of Alexander II's most significant achievements was the Treaty of York in 1237. This agreement with Henry III of England formally defined the border between Scotland and England, largely along the lines that still exist today. It was a crucial step in establishing Scotland's distinct national identity and sovereignty, bringing a degree of certainty to a border that had been a source of constant friction for centuries. Imagine the relief that must have washed over the border communities. no longer living under the constant threat of shifting allegiances and territorial disputes. The treaty, in essence, acknowledged Scotland as a separate and independent kingdom, a status that had been hard-won over generations. Under Alexander II, Scotland's cultural and religious life also flourished. Monasteries, many founded by David I, continued to be centres of learning and agricultural innovation. The Church, while connected to Rome, maintained a distinct Scottish character with its own saints and traditions. The construction of magnificent cathedrals such as Glasgow and Elgin continued, their soaring spires and intricate stonework a testament to the wealth and piety of the age. These buildings were not just places of worship, they were also expressions of national pride and artistic achievement. Alexander II died in 1249, leaving behind a kingdom that was arguably at its zenith. His son, Alexander III, was only 7 years old when he inherited the crown. Despite his youth, his reign, which lasted from 1249 to 1286, is often seen as the true pinnacle of Scotland's medieval golden age. For nearly 4 decades, Scotland enjoyed an unprecedented period of peace, prosperity, and stability. The economy thrived, based on exports of wool, hides, fish, and timber. The burghs continued to expand, and trade routes stretched across the North Sea, bringing wealth and new ideas to Scottish shores. Alexander III proved to be a shrewd and effective monarch. He continued his father's work in the West, finally securing the Hebrides and the Isle of Man from Norway through the Treaty of Perth in 1266, following the Battle of Largs in 1263. This battle, though not a decisive military victory, marked the end of Norse influence in the Western Isles, bringing these strategically important territories fully into the Scottish realm. It was a significant expansion of royal authority and a defining moment for Scotland's territorial integrity. Imagine the pride that must have swelled in the hearts of the Scots as these ancient Viking strongholds finally pledged allegiance to their king. The relationship with England under Alexander III was largely peaceful, cemented by his marriage to Margaret, daughter of Henry III of England. This marital alliance, while not preventing all diplomatic tensions, certainly fostered a period of relative calm along the border. The king's court became a centre of culture and administration, attracting scholars, artists, and skilled craftsmen. The legal system continued to develop, with the establishment of royal courts and the codification of laws, providing a framework for justice that was more consistent and accessible than in previous eras. Life for the ordinary Scot during this period, while still challenging by modern standards, was likely better than it had been for centuries. The population grew, settlements expanded, and there was a general sense of optimism. The land, fertile and productive, yielded good harvests, and the burgeoning trade provided opportunities for many. It was a time when Scotland truly felt like a unified kingdom, with a strong monarchy, a distinct identity, and a growing sense of national pride. Yet, even in this golden age, the seeds of future crisis were being sown. The question of succession, always a precarious matter in medieval monarchies, loomed large. Alexander III had 3 children with his first wife, Margaret, 2 sons, Alexander and David, and a daughter, Margaret. Tragically, all 3 of his legitimate children died before him. His son David died in infancy in 1281. His daughter Margaret married Eric II of Norway and gave birth to a daughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, in 1283. Then, in 1284, his elder son and heir, Alexander, also died without issue. The king's attempts to secure the succession by marrying a second time to Yolande de Dreux in 1285 were made with a sense of urgency, but no new heir was produced. The stage was set for a profound tragedy. On a stormy night in March 1286, Alexander III, riding alone in the dark to visit his new queen in Kinghorn, was thrown from his horse and killed. He was just 44 years old. The sudden, unexpected death of such a strong and beloved king, without a direct adult heir, plunged Scotland into immediate and profound uncertainty. The Golden Age, which had seemed so secure, ended abruptly, like a candle snuffed out by a sudden gust of wind. The immediate heir to the Scottish throne was now the 3-year-old Margaret, the Maid of Norway, Alexander III's granddaughter. Her claim was clear. But her youth and the fact that she was a foreign princess presented immense challenges. The Scottish magnates, the powerful nobles who held much of the land and influence, faced a dilemma. A child queen, especially one living abroad, would inevitably be a figurehead, and the country would require a regency council to govern in her name. This immediately opened the door to factionalism and disputes over who would wield real power. Historians still debate the exact circumstances of Alexander III's death. Was it simply a tragic accident, a king riding too fast in the dark, perhaps fueled by a desire to reach his young queen? Or was there something more sinister at play? While no evidence of foul play has ever emerged, the timing and the profound impact of his death have fueled centuries of speculation. The loss of a king at the height of his powers, leaving behind a fragile succession, was a catastrophic blow to a kingdom that had enjoyed such a long period of stability. The vacuum left by Alexander III's death created a power struggle among the leading Scottish families, each with their own ambitions and claims to influence. The Guardians of Scotland were appointed to govern the kingdom in the name of the young queen, but their unity was fragile. The most prominent claimants to the throne, should Margaret fail to reach adulthood or produce an heir, were Robert Bruce and John Balliol, both powerful Anglo-Norman magnates with substantial landholdings in both Scotland and England. Their rival claims, based on different interpretations of feudal law and lineage, would soon become a central point of contention. The Maid of Norway, the fragile hope for Scotland's future, embarked on a journey from Norway to Scotland in 1290. But fate, it seemed, had another cruel twist in store. The young queen, barely 7 years old, fell ill during the voyage and died in Orkney, never having set foot on the mainland of the kingdom she was meant to rule. Her death was a devastating blow, extinguishing the last direct line of succession from William the Lion and Alexander III. With Margaret's death, the Scottish throne was left vacant, and no obvious succession. Essa remained. The kingdom, which had enjoyed nearly a century and a half of relative peace and prosperity under the strong hand of the House of Canmore, was now plunged into a profound succession crisis. The calm waters of the Golden Age had given way to a turbulent sea, and the future of Scotland hung precariously in the balance. The stage was set for a period of intense rivalry, external interference, and ultimately, a struggle for national survival that would define the next century of Scottish history. The whispers of the wind carried not just the salt spray from the northern seas, but also the anxieties of a nation facing an uncertain dawn. The winds of change, often heralded by the clash of steel, began to sweep across Scotland with a chilling intensity as the 13th century drew to a close. The delicate balance of power, so carefully maintained, shattered with the death of the young Queen Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290. Her passing plunged Scotland into a succession crisis, a void that the ambitious King Edward I of England, often called Longshanks, was all too eager to fill. He saw in Scotland's turmoil an opportunity to extend his dominion, to bring the Northern Kingdom firmly under his English crown. Edward, invited by the Scottish magnates to arbitrate the succession, initially presented himself as a neutral arbiter, a wise and just king. Yet his true intentions soon became clear. He declared himself overlord of Scotland and, in 1292, chose John Balliol, a man he believed he could easily manipulate, as the new King of Scots. Balliol, a man of gentle disposition and perhaps less political acumen than the times demanded, found himself trapped between the demands of his Scottish nobles and the overbearing authority of Edward. The English king treated Scotland as a vassal state, demanding homage, military service, and even hearing appeals from Scottish courts, effectively undermining Balliol's sovereignty at every turn. The Scottish lords, proud and fiercely independent, chafed under this humiliation. Their resentment simmered, a low, dangerous rumble beneath the surface of a seemingly compliant kingdom. In 1295, the Scottish nobility, unable to bear Edward's provocations any longer, formed an alliance with France, a traditional enemy of England. This bold defiance, known as the Auld Alliance, was a direct challenge to Edward's authority. His response was swift and brutal. In 1296, Edward I invaded Scotland with a massive army, intent on crushing any resistance. The ensuing campaign was devastating. The English sacked Berwick-upon-Tweed, a prosperous Scottish port, with horrific brutality, a clear message of Edward's resolve. King John Balliol, his spirit broken, was forced to abdicate his throne, stripped of his royal insignia in a public display of humiliation, earning him the moniker Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat. Edward then seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scottish kings, and transported it to Westminster Abbey, a symbolic act meant to signify the end of Scottish independence. He declared himself King of Scotland, leaving the country under English administration, with English officials and garrisons scattered across the land. It seemed, to many, that Scotland's long history as an independent nation had come to an abrupt and ignominious end. But the spirit of a nation, once kindled, is not so easily extinguished. From the ashes of defeat, a new kind of resistance began to stir, not from the high nobility, many of whom had either submitted or fled, but from the common folk, from men who had little to lose but their freedom. Among them emerged a figure whose name would forever be etched into the heart of Scottish legend: William Wallace. A lesser nobleman, perhaps even a commoner by some accounts, Wallace's exact origins remain shrouded in the mists of time, a testament to his rise from obscurity. He first appears in historical records in 1297, leading a small band of men in a daring attack on Lanark, killing the English sheriff William Heselrigg. This act of defiance, small in scale but immense in symbolism, ignited a spark of hope across the subjugated land. Wallace quickly gathered followers, men who shared his burning desire for liberty men who had witnessed the injustices and cruelties of English rule. His charisma, military prowess, and unwavering commitment to Scottish independence resonated deeply with the common people. He was not fighting for a crown or a noble title, but for the very soul of Scotland. Simultaneously, in the north, Andrew Moray, another formidable leader, was also raising an army independent, challenging English authority. The two forces, born of a shared grievance, would soon converge. The culmination of their early efforts came in September 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Edward, confident in his military might, sent a large army north under the command of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham. The Scottish forces, led by Wallace and Moray, were significantly outnumbered, but they held a crucial advantage. Their knowledge of the terrain and a brilliant tactical mind. The English army, heavy cavalry and foot soldiers alike, had to cross a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth to reach the Scottish positions. Wallace and Moray waited patiently, allowing a portion of the English army to cross before launching their attack. As the English forces were bottlenecked on the bridge, the Scots unleashed a furious assault. The English cavalry, unable to maneuver in the confined space, became trapped and were cut down mercilessly. Cressingham was killed, his body reportedly flayed by the Scots in a gruesome act of vengeance. Surrey, witnessing the carnage, ordered a retreat, but it was too late for many of his men. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was a stunning victory, a psychological triumph that sent shockwaves through both Scotland and England. It proved that the English army, despite its formidable reputation, was not invincible. For a brief period, Wallace and Moray effectively liberated Scotland from English rule. Moray, unfortunately, was mortally wounded in the battle, leaving Wallace as the sole guardian of this newfound freedom. Wallace, now hailed as the Guardian of Scotland, launched raids into northern England, further solidifying his reputation and inspiring his countrymen. Edward I, however, was not a king to suffer defeat lightly. He returned from Flanders, enraged by the Scottish uprising, and assembled an even larger army, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. In July 1298, the two armies met at the Battle of Falkirk. This time, Edward's military genius, particularly his effective use of longbowmen against the Scottish schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, proved decisive. The Scottish spearmen, though formidable against cavalry, were vulnerable to the hail of arrows from the English archers. Wallace's army was decimated, and he was forced to retreat, his dreams of a free Scotland momentarily shattered. After Falkirk, Wallace resigned his guardianship, his star dimming as the reality of English power reasserted itself. He spent several years in continental Europe, seeking support for the Scottish cause from the Pope and the French king, though with limited success. He returned to Scotland around 1303, a hunted man, continuing a guerrilla war against the English. In 1305, he was finally betrayed and captured near Glasgow, handed over to the English and transported to London. There, he faced a show trial, accused of treason against a king he never recognised. Wallace famously declared, "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe no allegiance to the English crown." He was brutally executed in London on August 23, 1305. His body dismembered and displayed across Scotland as a warning to others. Yet his death far from quelling the Scottish spirit, only cemented his place as a martyr and a symbol of enduring resistance. Even as Wallace's legacy was being forged in blood and sacrifice, another figure was preparing to step onto the stage, one who would ultimately fulfill the dream of Scottish independence. Robert the Bruce. The Bruce family was one of the most powerful noble houses in Scotland, with a strong claim to the throne through their royal lineage. Robert the Bruce, unlike Wallace, was a high-ranking nobleman, a man of complex allegiances and political manoeuvring. He had initially sworn fealty to Edward I, then supported the Scottish cause, then submitted to Edward again after Falkirk, a pragmatism that historians still debate as to whether it was genuine var. Citizen or a calculated long game. Some argue he was simply biding his time, waiting for the opportune moment to strike, while others suggest his early actions reflected genuine struggle with his conscience and the immense pressure of the political landscape. The turning point for Bruce came in February 1306. He met with John Comyn, another powerful Scottish magnate and a rival claimant to the throne, at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. The details of their meeting are murky, lost to the annals of history, but it ended in tragedy. Bruce, in a fit of rage, or perhaps a premeditated act, stamped Comyn to death before the high altar. This act, a sacrilege in the eyes of the church, immediately branded Bruce an outlaw, an excommunicate. It was a point of no return. With nothing left to lose, Bruce declared himself King of Scots at Scone just a few weeks later, on March 25, 1306. His initial reign was fraught with peril. Edward I, furious at this new defiance, sent armies north to crush Bruce. Bruce suffered several defeats, his forces scattered, and he was forced to become a fugitive, hiding in the wild, untamed lands of Scotland. The legend of the spider, often told to illustrate his perseverance, speaks of him watching a spider repeatedly try and fail to spin its web, only to succeed on its seventh attempt, inspiring him not to give up. While likely apocryphal, the tale captures the essence of his spirit during these dark times. He was hunted relentlessly, his family captured, and some of his relatives executed by the English. But Bruce, unlike Balliol, possessed an iron will and an unshakable belief in his right to rule. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to rebuild his forces, learning from his early mistakes. He adopted guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles where the English held a numerical advantage, and instead launching swift, devastating raids. He destroyed castles rather than trying to hold them, denying the English strongholds and forcing them to expend resources on rebuilding or abandoning them. He understood the psychology of his people and the weariness of the English occupiers. The death of Edward I in 1307 offered a glimmer of hope. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's military genius and ruthless determination. While Edward II continued the war, his efforts were often half-hearted and poorly executed, giving Bruce valuable time to consolidate his power and gain support. Over the next few years, Bruce steadily recaptured Scottish castles and drove out English garrisons, his reputation growing with each victory. He was a king fighting for his kingdom, and the Scottish people rallied to his banner. By 1314, only a few Scottish castles remained in English hands, most notably Stirling Castle, a strategically vital stronghold. The English governor of Stirling Castle, Philip Mowbray, agreed to surrender if not relieved by an English army by Midsummer's Day, June 24th. This agreement forced Edward II's hand. He assembled a massive army, perhaps the largest English army ever to invade Scotland, and marched north to relieve Stirling. Robert the Bruce, knowing this would be the decisive battle, gathered his own forces, though they were significantly outnumbered. The two armies met near Stirling, at the field of Bannockburn. Bruce, a master strategist, chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on high ground, protected by a stream and boggy terrain that would hinder the English heavy cavalry. He also ordered the digging of potholes, small, camouflaged pits designed to break the charge of the English knights. The battle itself, fought over 2 days in June 1314, was a testament to Bruce's leadership and the unwavering courage of the Scottish soldiers. On the first day, a famous incident occurred when Henry de Bohun, an English knight, spotted Bruce riding alone and charged him, lance lowered. Bruce, armed only with an axe, skillfully dodged the charge and with a single powerful blow split de Bohun's helmet and head. This act of personal bravery, witnessed by both armies, was a huge morale boost for the Scots. The main battle took place on June the 24th. The English cavalry, hampered by the terrain and the Scottish potholes, struggled to make headway against the tightly packed Scottish schiltrons. The Scottish spearmen, disciplined and resolute, held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties on the English. Edward II, witnessing the disaster unfolding, fled the field. A move that shattered the morale of his remaining forces. The English army, once mighty and seemingly invincible, was utterly routed. Thousands were killed and many more captured. The Battle of Bannockburn was a monumental victory for Scotland, a resounding affirmation of its independence. It secured Robert the Bruce's position as King of Scots and effectively ended English attempts to conquer the nation for decades to come. The victory, however, did not immediately bring peace. Edward II refused to acknowledge Bruce as king, and the war continued for several more years, with Scottish raids into northern England and diplomatic efforts to secure international recognition. It was not until 1328, with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, that England finally recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom, with Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. The long, arduous struggle for sovereignty, initiated by the succession crisis and fuelled by the defiance of men like Wallace and the strategic brilliance of Bruce, had finally reached its triumphant conclusion. Scotland had endured, its identity forged in the crucible of war, its spirit unbroken. The legacy of Wallace, the martyr, and Bruce, the king, intertwined forever, became the bedrock of Scottish nationhood, inspiring generations to come with tales of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring fight for freedom. The echoes of their battles, the whispers of their defiance, still resonate in the glens and mountains of Scotland, a testament to a people who refused to yield. The crown, though worn, still rested uneasily upon Robert the Bruce's head. His coronation at Scone in 1306 had been a defiant act, a direct challenge to English authority, and it plunged Scotland deeper into a war that had already bled its people for years. For the first few years of his reign, Bruce was a king in name more than fact, a fugitive hunted across his own land. He knew the glens and mountains of Scotland intimately, often sleeping rough, relying on the loyalty of a few steadfast followers and the harsh terrain to evade capture. These were years of desperate guerrilla warfare, small skirmishes, and narrow escapes, forging a leader who understood the very earth beneath his feet. The turning point, the moment when the tide truly began to shift, arrived with a series of strategic victories that chipped away at English control. Bruce's tactics were often unconventional, favouring swift, decisive strikes against isolated garrisons rather than direct confrontation with larger English armies. He learned from past mistakes, understanding that Scotland's strength lay not in mirroring English military might, but in exploiting its own rugged landscape and the fierce determination of its people. One such pivotal moment came in 1313 with the recapture of Roxburgh Castle, a formidable English stronghold. Legend has it that Sir James Douglas, Bruce's loyal lieutenant, led a daring night assault, scaling the walls with rope ladders, their faces blackened with soot, under the cover of darkness and a festive Shrove Tuesday celebration within the castle. This audacious feat, alongside similar victories at Edinburgh Castle and Stirling, demonstrated that no English garrison was truly safe, and it slowly began to restore faith in Bruce's leadership. The pressure mounted, both for Bruce to consolidate his gains and for the English to reassert their dominance. Edward II, less formidable than his father Edward I, but still commanding immense resources, gathered a vast army. His objective was clear: relieve the siege of Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold in Scotland, and crush the rebellion once and for all. Bruce, recognizing the moment of truth had arrived, chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces south of Stirling, near the Bannockburn, a winding stream that would protect his flanks and funnel the English cavalry into a narrower, less advantageous space. His army, though smaller, was well disciplined and highly motivated, a force forged in years of hardship and guerrilla warfare. The Battle of Bannockburn, fought over 2 days in June 1314, remains one of the most iconic and decisive moments in Scottish history. On the first day, skirmishes tested the lines, and the legendary encounter between Robert the Bruce and the English knight Sir Henry de Bohun took place. De Bohun, spotting Bruce riding ahead of his army, charged, lance lowered, hoping to end the war with a single blow. Bruce, armed with only an axe, waited until the last moment, then swerved his pony, rising in his stirrups to cleave de Bohun's helmet and skull with a single powerful stroke. This act, witnessed by both armies, was a powerful morale booster for the Scots and a chilling omen for the English. The main battle unfolded on the second day. Bruce had ordered his men to dig hidden pits or potties filled with sharpened stakes, concealed by brushwood, to disrupt the English cavalry charge. This simple yet effective tactic proved devastating. As the heavily armoured English knights advanced, they stumbled into the traps, their formations breaking, their momentum lost. The Scottish schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, stood firm, a bristling hedge of steel against the English onslaught. The sheer numbers of the English army, which had seemed an advantage, now became a liability, as they were cramped and unable to maneuver effectively on the broken terrain. Panic began to spread through the English ranks, exacerbated by the sight of Scottish camp followers, mistaken for fresh reserves descending from the hills. The rout was complete, a catastrophic defeat for Edward II, and a glorious, almost miraculous victory for Robert the Bruce. Bannockburn did not immediately end the war, but it irrevocably shifted the balance of power. It cemented Robert the Bruce's position as the undisputed King of Scots and dealt a shattering blow to English prestige and military might. The immediate aftermath saw Scottish raids deep into northern England, a demonstration of their newfound strength and a means of extracting reparations. Yet, despite the triumph, English recognition of Scottish independence remained elusive. Edward II, humiliated, refused to acknowledge Bruce as king, perpetuating a state of war that continued to drain both nations. It was in this climate, in 1320, that the Scottish nobles and community gathered at Arbroath Abbey, composed a letter to Pope John XXII. This document, now known as the Declaration of Arbroath, is one of the most eloquent and powerful statements of national sovereignty ever penned. It was not merely a plea for papal recognition, but a profound articulation of the Scottish people's right to self-determination. The declaration famously stated, "For so long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never in any degree be subject to the dominion of the English. For it is not for glory, riches, or honours that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life." This passage, echoing through the centuries, captures the very essence of the Scottish struggle. It presented Robert the Bruce not as a usurper, but as the chosen leader of a free people, a king who had delivered them from oppression. The Declaration of Arbroath was a masterstroke of diplomacy. While it did not immediately secure papal recognition, it swayed international opinion and put immense pressure on the English crown. The Pope, initially siding with Edward II, began to shift his stance, recognizing the legitimacy of Bruce's claim and the undeniable reality of Scottish independence. The Declaration's influence extended far beyond its immediate goal. It became a foundational text for Scottish national identity, and, some historians argue, even influenced later declarations of independence, such as that of the United States. The years following Bannockburn and the Declaration of Arbroath was still fraught with tension and intermittent conflict, but the momentum was undeniably with Scotland. Edward II's reign was plagued by internal strife and a growing unpopularity, further weakening his ability to wage war effectively against the Scots. His eventual deposition in 1327 and the ascension of his young son, Edward III, created an opportunity for a lasting peace. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed in 1328, finally brought the long and brutal wars of Scottish independence to an end. It was a monumental achievement for Robert the Bruce, the culmination of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. The treaty formally recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom, and Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. It also included a marriage alliance between Bruce's son and heir, David, and Edward III's sister, Joan, further cementing the peace. The bells of Scotland must have rung with a profound sense of relief and triumph, a sound that carried across the glens and lochs, signifying the dawn of a new era. With independence secured, Robert the Bruce turned his attention to consolidating his kingdom and establishing a stable succession. The Bruce dynasty, born from the crucible of war, now needed to build a foundation for lasting peace. He worked to restore law and order, to rebuild a land ravaged by decades of conflict, and to strengthen the institutions of government. His reign saw the re-establishment of a more centralized royal authority, a necessary step after the fragmentation of power during the war years. However, the peace was fragile. The scars of war ran deep, and the English Plantagenet claim to overlordship, though renounced, lingered in the minds of some. Robert the Bruce himself was not destined to enjoy a long period of peace. His health, likely weakened by the hardships of his early reign and perhaps by a debilitating illness such as leprosy, began to fail. He died in 1329, just a year after the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, at the relatively young age of 54. His death plunged Scotland into a period of uncertainty, as his heir, David II, was a mere child. Before his death, Bruce made a final, poignant request that his heart be carried to the Holy Land on crusade, a testament to the chivalric ideals of the age and perhaps a penance for his earlier excommunication. Sir James Douglas, his loyal companion, undertook this solemn duty, but tragically died fighting the Moors in Spain, carrying the casket containing Bruce's heart. The heart was eventually returned to Scotland and interred at Melrose Abbey, while Bruce's body rests at Dunfermline Abbey, a king at peace in the land he had fought so fiercely to free. The establishment of the Bruce dynasty, though short-lived in its direct male line, marked a pivotal moment in Scottish history. It secured a period of independence that allowed Scotland to develop its own unique identity and institutions. Free from the immediate threat of English annexation, the legacy of Robert the Bruce, the warrior king who transformed from a hunted fugitive to the liberator of his nation, became a powerful symbol of Scottish resilience and determination. His story, interwoven with the dramatic events of Bannockburn and the eloquent plea of Arbroath, continues to inspire, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, even with the peace treaty and the establishment of the Bruce Line, the seeds of future conflict remained. The English, though defeated, did not entirely abandon their ambitions. Historians still debate the extent to which the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton truly represented a complete abandonment of English claims, or merely a tactical retreat forced by circumstance. Some argue that Edward III, despite his youth, harboured a deep-seated desire to avenge his father's humiliation, a desire that would manifest itself in renewed hostilities in the decades to come. The peace, therefore, was less a definitive end to the Anglo-Scottish Wars and more a significant pause, a moment for Scotland to breathe and consolidate its hard-won freedom before the next storm inevitably gathered on the horizon. The memory of Bannockburn, a glorious victory, also served as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to maintain that freedom. The whispers of the wind across the battlefield, perhaps, carried not only the echoes of triumph, but also the quiet understanding that the struggle for Scotland's soul was a continuous one. A story that would continue to unfold across the centuries. The fragility of peace, even after such a momentous struggle, was a lesson learned hard and often in medieval Scotland. The quiet peace that Robert the Bruce had so carefully cultivated for Scotland, a peace he had hoped would endure for generations, began to fray even before his death. His final years were marked by a grim understanding that England, though defeated, had not truly relinquished its claims. He had secured the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, a hard-won recognition of Scottish independence. But such treaties, like so many promises etched in parchment, were only as strong as the will to uphold them, and that will on the English side was already wavering. When Bruce passed in 1329, leaving behind his young son, David II, a mere 5-year-old, the vulnerability of Scotland was laid bare. A child king was a beacon for ambition, both foreign and domestic. The Regency Council, led by the formidable Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, and then by Donald, Earl of Mar, struggled to maintain the delicate balance of power. But the seeds of discontent had already been sown. Many Scottish nobles, disinherited by Bruce for their support of England during the wars, clamoured for the return of their lands. These disinherited, as they were known, found a powerful champion in Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John Balliol. Edward Balliol, a man who had long lived in the shadow of his father's perceived failures, saw his chance. With the tacit and sometimes overt support of the young English King Edward III, Balliol launched an invasion in 1332. He landed in Fife, a bold move, and swiftly defeated a larger Scottish army at the Battle of Duplin Moor. It was a stunning victory, achieved through tactical brilliance and the element of surprise. Balliol was crowned King of Scots at Scone, a fleeting triumph that marked the beginning of what historians often call the Second War of Scottish Independence. David II, the legitimate heir, was spirited away to France for his safety, a poignant echo of his own father's early life spent in exile. Scotland was once again plunged into a brutal civil war, a war that was as much about internal power struggles as it was about English interference. Edward III, seeing an opportunity to undo the humiliation of his father's reign, openly supported Balliol. He demanded homage from Balliol, effectively making Scotland a vassal state once more. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was summarily repudiated. The ensuing years were a relentless cycle of sieges, skirmishes, and shifting allegiances. The English under Edward III proved to be a far more formidable foe than his father, Edward II. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 was a devastating defeat for the Scots, a crushing blow that saw many of the remaining Bruce loyalists fall. It was a battle that showcased the growing effectiveness of English longbowmen, a weapon that would dominate European battlefields for decades to come. Following this victory, Edward III annexed much of southern Scotland, carving out territories for his English allies and Balliol's supporters. Yet even in its darkest hour, the spirit of Scottish resistance flickered. Figures like Sir Andrew Murray, nephew of the great William Wallace, and later Robert Stewart, Bruce's grandson, rallied the remaining loyalists. They employed guerrilla tactics, harassing English garrisons and preventing them from solidifying their control. This period saw the rise of many lesser-known heroes, men and women who, through their quiet acts of defiance, kept the flame of independence alive. Perhaps these were the years when the very stones of the Scottish glens learned to whisper tales of resilience. The return of David II from France in 1341, though he was still young, breathed new life into the Scottish cause. He was no military genius, but his presence provided a legitimate focal point for resistance. However, his reign would be marked by misfortune and misjudgment. In 1346, attempting to aid his French allies during the 100 Years' War, David II led a Scottish invasion of England. This ill-fated expedition culminated in the Battle of Neville's Cross, where the Scottish army was routed and David himself was captured. His capture plunged Scotland into another period of uncertainty and regency. For 11 long years, David II remained a prisoner in England. The ransom demanded for his release was astronomical, a crippling burden on the Scottish economy. Historians still debate the true impact of David's captivity. Some argue that it further weakened an already fragile kingdom, diverting resources and attention from internal development. Others suggest that the regency, led by Robert Stewart, gained valuable experience in governance, albeit under immense pressure. When David II finally returned to Scotland in 1357, having secured his release through a series of treaties and promises, he found a kingdom weary but not broken. He attempted to rule with a firm hand, but his policies were often unpopular. He alienated many nobles, and his personal life, marked by a childless marriage and later a controversial second marriage, further complicated matters. His attempts to secure an English succession to the Scottish throne, a desperate measure to reduce the ransom payments, were met with fierce resistance and outrage. This proposed union, which would have effectively undone all of Bruce's work, was a testament to the immense pressure he faced, but also to a lack of foresight that contrasted sharply with his father's strategic genius. Upon David II's death in 1371, without a direct heir, the Scottish throne passed to his nephew, Robert Stewart, the son of Bruce's daughter, Marjorie. This marked the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, a lineage that would rule Scotland for over 3 centuries. Robert II, as he became known, was a man of advanced years when he ascended the throne. He was a cautious ruler, perhaps too cautious for a kingdom still reeling from decades of war and instability. His reign was characterized by a desire for peace and consolidation, but also by the growing power of the Scottish nobility, who had become accustomed to asserting their influence during the long periods of regency. The early Stuart kings faced immense challenges. The legacy of the Wars of Independence, the crippling debt from David II's ransom, and the ever-present threat of English aggression cast a long shadow. Robert II and his son Robert III were often perceived as weak rulers, unable to fully control their powerful and ambitious nobles. This period saw a rise in internal feuds and lawlessness, particularly in the Highlands, where clan chiefs often acted with impunity. The Crown's authority was frequently challenged, and the concept of a unified Scottish nation, so painstakingly forged by Bruce, seemed to be fracturing. One of the lesser-known aspects of this era is the increasing importance of the Scottish Parliament. While it had existed in various forms before, the need for national consensus, particularly regarding the ransom payments and foreign policy, gave it new prominence. Nobles, clergy, and burgh representatives gathered, not always in harmony, to debate and decide the fate of the kingdom. This growing parliamentary tradition, though still far from a modern democratic institution, laid some of the groundwork for future political developments. The English, though often preoccupied with their own internal struggles and the 100 Years' War with France, continued to meddle in Scottish affairs. They supported disgruntled nobles, launched raids across the border, and maintained their claim to suzerainty whenever the opportunity arose. The famous Battle of Otterburn in 1388, though a Scottish victory, was a testament to the ongoing border warfare that defined this period. It was a brutal, moonlit clash, celebrated in ballads, where the Scottish Earl of Douglas was killed, but his forces ultimately triumphed against the English. This battle, fought in the dead of night, stands as a vivid example of the fierce, personal nature of medieval warfare. Robert III, who succeeded his father in 1390, was a physically infirm and perhaps temperamentally unsuited king. He suffered a debilitating injury early in his life, and his reign was largely dominated by his ambitious brother, Robert, Duke of Albany. Albany effectively ruled Scotland as regent for much of Robert III's reign, a period marked by political intrigue and the mysterious death of the king's eldest son, David, Duke of Rothesay. The circumstances of Rothesay's death in Falkland Palace in 1402 remain a subject of historical debate. Was it illness, as officially claimed, or was he starved to death on Albany's orders, a dark chapter in the Stuart family's history? This unresolved mystery highlights the precariousness of power and the ruthlessness that often accompanied dynastic struggles. Fearing for the safety of his remaining son, James, Robert III sent him to France in 1406. However, The ship carrying the young prince was intercepted by English pirates, and James was captured. He would spend the next 18 years as a prisoner in England, a cruel echo of his great-uncle David II's fate. Robert III died shortly after hearing of his son's capture, reportedly of a broken heart. With James I a captive in England, Albany continued to rule as regent, effectively holding the reins of power for the remainder of his life, and then, after his death, his own son, Murdoch, took over. This long period of regency, spanning over 3 decades, saw the power of the crown diminish further, while the great noble families, particularly the Douglases and the Earls of Ross, grew increasingly powerful and independent. They built their own mini-kingdoms, often challenging the regent's authority and engaging in private warfare. The return of James I in 1424, after his long captivity, marked a turning point. He was a man shaped by his English upbringing, well-educated and determined to restore royal authority. He had witnessed the strength of the English monarchy and was resolved to implement similar reforms in Scotland. His reign began with a ruthless consolidation of power, striking down those nobles who had grown too powerful during his absence. He executed Murdoch Stewart and many of his family, a brutal act that sent a clear message to the Scottish nobility. James I was a king of contradictions, a poet and musician, yet also a stern and unforgiving ruler. He attempted to reform the Scottish legal system, improve the economy, and bring the Highlands under royal control. He was a visionary in many ways, but his methods were often heavy-handed, creating powerful enemies among the nobility. His attempts to centralize power and fill the royal coffers led to resentment and conspiracies. The memory of the Second War of Independence, the long years of captivity for 2 kings, and the constant threat from England had instilled in the Scots a fierce sense of national identity, even amidst their internal divisions. The early Stuart kings, despite their weaknesses and misfortunes, inherited this legacy. They were forced to navigate a complex political landscape, balancing the ambitions of their own nobles with the ever-present shadow of English aggression. The stage was set for a new chapter in Scottish history, one where the struggle for independence would continue, not just against foreign invaders, but also within the very heart of the kingdom itself. The gentle whisper of the wind through the heather might have carried the laments of the fallen, but it also carried the enduring hope of a free and sovereign Scotland. A hope that refused to be extinguished. The echoes of James I's tragic end in the Blackfriars, Perth, rippled through the kingdom, a stark reminder of the precariousness of power in medieval Scotland. His son, James II, inherited the throne as a mere 6-year-old in 1437, plunging the country once more into the turbulent waters of a royal minority. The familiar dance of regents and ambitious nobles began anew, each vying for control over the young king and, by extension, the levers of state. The Crichtons and the Livingstons, 2 prominent families, became the central figures in this power struggle, their rivalry often spilling into open conflict, their retinues clashing in the very streets of Edinburgh. It was a time of shifting alliances and betrayals, where loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold. Amidst this chaos, the young James II grew, his childhood a tapestry woven with lessons in survival and the harsh realities of Scottish politics. He was a king in name, but for years his authority was a mere shadow. Yet beneath the surface of this enforced submission, a steely resolve began to harden. He learned to observe, to wait, to understand the intricate web of power that bound and threatened his kingdom. By the time he reached his majority, James II was determined to assert his royal prerogative, to bring order to a realm that had, for too long, been fractured by baronial ambition. His reign, which officially began in 1449, was marked by a relentless campaign to curb the power of the great magnates, a task his father had begun but left unfinished. The most formidable of these noble houses was the Black Douglases, a family whose wealth, lands, and military might rivaled that of the crown itself. They controlled vast swathes of southern Scotland, their influence stretching from the borders to the Highlands. And their alliances with other powerful families made them a seemingly unassailable force. James II understood that to truly rule, he had to confront this challenge head-on. The relationship between the king and the 8th Earl of Douglas, William, was a complex and volatile one. For a time, they seemed to coexist, even to cooperate. But the underlying tension, the inherent clash between royal supremacy and baronial independence, was always present. The Earl of Douglas, with his immense resources, often acted as a king in his own right, dispensing justice, raising armies, and even conducting foreign policy. This was an affront James II could not long tolerate. The climax of this struggle came in 1452, an event that remains one of the most dramatic and controversial in Scottish history. James II invited William, the 8th Earl of Douglas, to Stirling Castle, offering him a safe conduct, a royal guarantee of his safety. The purpose was ostensibly to discuss the state of the kingdom, to reconcile their differences, but the meeting quickly devolved into a heated argument. James, in a fit of rage, demanded that Douglas break his bond with other powerful nobles, a bond that the king saw as a direct challenge to his authority. When Douglas refused, James, in a moment of impulsive fury, drew his dagger and stabbed the earl. His courtiers, perhaps sensing the shift in power, quickly followed suit, ensuring Douglas's death. This act, while shocking, was a clear and brutal declaration of royal intent. It sent a shiver through the Scottish nobility, a stark message that the king would tolerate no rivals. The murder of the Earl of Douglas, a violation of safe conduct and an act of regicide in all but name, was a calculated risk. It ignited a brief but fierce civil war, as the Douglas family, now led by William's brother James, rose in rebellion. For 3 years, the kingdom was again embroiled in conflict. But James II, with shrewd political maneuvering and military skill, systematically dismantled the Douglas power base. He besieged their castles, confiscated their lands, and ultimately, in 1455, defeated them decisively at the Battle of Arkinholm. The Black Douglas, for centuries, a cornerstone of Scottish power, were utterly broken, their vast estates forfeited to the crown. This victory marked a significant turning point, cementing the Stuart monarchy's authority in a way that had eluded previous kings. With the Douglases subdued, James II continued his efforts to strengthen royal administration and finances. He was a king who understood the importance of law and order, and he worked to enforce justice throughout the realm, often travelling personally to dispense it. He also sought to expand Scotland's influence on the European stage, forging alliances and engaging in diplomatic relations. His reign, though tragically cut short, laid much of the groundwork for a more centralised and powerful monarchy. However, fate, often a cruel mistress to Scottish kings, intervened once more. In 1460, while besieging Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English strongholds in Scotland, James II was killed by an exploding cannon. He was only 29 years old. The image of the young king, eager to reclaim lost territories and assert his nation's strength, perishing in such a sudden and violent manner, is a poignant one. His death left another child, James III, to inherit the throne, once again plunging Scotland into the familiar cycle of a royal minority. James III, born in 1451, ascended the throne at the tender age of 9. His minority, like those before him, was marked by the ambitions of powerful noble factions. The Boyds, a rising family, gained significant influence, effectively controlling the young king and much of the government for a period. This period of Boyd dominance, however, was short-lived. By 1469, James III, now a young man, asserted his independence and swiftly moved against the Boyds, stripping them of their power and lands. Unlike his father and grandfather, James III was not primarily a warrior king. He was, by many accounts, a man of more refined tastes, with a keen interest in architecture, art, and music. He fostered a court culture that reflected these interests, bringing in artists, musicians, and craftsmen from across Europe. He was also deeply interested in astrology and alchemy, pursuits that, while common among European monarchs of the era, sometimes led to accusations of being overly influenced by low-born favourites, much to the chagrin of the traditional nobility. His reign was characterised by a different kind of struggle than those of his predecessors. While he did face challenges from powerful nobles, his primary conflicts were often political and personal, rather than purely military. He sought to maintain peace with England, a policy that was not always popular with a nobility eager for military glory and the spoils of war. He also pursued an ambitious foreign policy, securing the strategically important Orkney and Shetland Islands from Norway in 1468 as part of his marriage treaty with Margaret of Denmark, a significant expansion of Scottish territory. This acquisition, though achieved through diplomacy rather than conquest, remains a testament to his ambition. Yet, despite these achievements, James III's reign was plagued by internal dissent and a growing unpopularity among his own nobility. His perceived favoritism towards certain individuals, particularly those outside the traditional aristocratic circles, bred resentment. His reliance on men like Thomas Cochrane, a skilled architect and musician, for political advice and financial management alienated many of the established magnates who felt their counsel was being ignored. This simmering discontent eventually boiled over. In 1482, a significant crisis erupted. While campaigning against the English, James III's army, camped at Lauder Bridge, mutinied. A group of powerful nobles, led by Archibald Bell the Cat Douglas, the 5th Earl of Angus, seized the king and executed his favourites, including Thomas Cochrane, by hanging them from the bridge. This dramatic event, known as the Lauder Bridge Incident, was a humiliating blow to royal authority. James III was effectively imprisoned by his own nobles for a time, his power severely curtailed. He eventually regained some measure of control, but the trust between the king and his nobility was irrevocably broken. The latter years of his reign were marked by a series of conspiracies and rebellions, culminating in a devastating civil war. His own son, the future James IV, was drawn into the rebellion against him, a tragic testament to the deep divisions within the Scottish court. In 1488, the forces loyal to James III clashed with the rebel army, led by his son, at the Battle of Souchyburn, near Stirling. The king's army was defeated, and James III himself was killed while attempting to flee the battlefield. The exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest he was murdered by a rebel soldier after being unhorsed, while others claim he was killed by a priest who was also a rebel sympathizer. The lack of a clear, definitive account has fueled historical debate for centuries. Was it an act of deliberate assassination or a tragic accident in the chaos of battle? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between, lost to the mists of time and the partisan accounts of the era. Regardless, his death brought an end to a reign that had promised much but delivered little in terms of stability. A stark contrast to the forceful rule of his father. With the death of James III, his son, James IV, ascended the throne at the age of 15. His reign would mark a new chapter for Scotland, one of renewed royal authority and cultural flourishing. But the groundwork for this was laid by the struggles and sacrifices of his predecessors. The later Stuart kings, James I, II, and III, each in their own way grappled with the fundamental challenge of medieval Scottish monarchy. How to consolidate power in a kingdom where powerful noble families often acted as independent rulers. James I, through his initial reforms and brutal suppression of dissent, had sought to establish a strong central government, but his violent end underscored the dangers of such an approach. James II, learning from his father's fate, adopted a more systematic and ultimately successful strategy to dismantle the power of the greatest magnates, most notably the Black Douglases. His decisive actions, though sometimes ruthless, laid the foundation for a more powerful crown. James III, with his intellectual inclinations and less martial approach, attempted to govern through different means, but his failure to manage the powerful nobility, coupled with his perceived favoritism, led to his downfall. These reigns, spanning much of the 15th century, were a period of intense political maneuvering. Punctuated by violence and intrigue, the kings, often starting as child monarchs, had to navigate a treacherous landscape of ambitious regions, feuding nobles, and constant threats to their authority. They learned, often through bitter experience, that the Scottish crown, while theoretically supreme, had to constantly assert its dominance through a delicate balance of force, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. The legacies of these kings are complex. Remembered for his poetic talents and his attempts at legal reform, is also defined by his violent end. James II, often called Fiery Face due to a distinctive birthmark, is celebrated for his decisive defeat of the Douglases and his role in strengthening the monarchy. James III, a king of culture and intellect, remains a figure of tragedy, his reign marked by discord and ultimately his death at the hands of his own subjects. Yet, despite their individual fates and differing approaches, these three Jameses collectively contributed to the slow, arduous process of building a more centralised and powerful Scottish state. They wrestled with the intractable problem of baronial power, a problem that had plagued Scotland for centuries. Their efforts, though often fraught with peril and marked by personal tragedy, gradually shifted the balance of power in favour of the crown. The Scotland that emerged from the 15th century was still a kingdom of powerful lords and regional differences. But the Stuart monarchy, through the trials of these reigns, had undeniably gained a stronger footing. The stage was set for the reign of James IV, a monarch who would inherit a more stable, albeit still challenging, kingdom. Ready to embark on a golden age for the Scottish Renaissance. The dawn of the 16th century in Scotland was heralded by the reign of James IV, a monarch who perhaps more than any before him embodied the spirit of the Renaissance that was sweeping across Europe. He was a king of contradictions, a devout Catholic who fathered numerous illegitimate children, a shrewd diplomat who ultimately led his nation to a catastrophic defeat, and a patron of the arts whose martial ambitions would prove his undoing. Yet, in his time, Scotland experienced a period of unparalleled cultural and intellectual flourishing, a golden age that still gleams faintly through the mists of history. James IV ascended to the throne in 1488, following the rebellion that led to his father's death at the Battle of Sorkyburn. The weight of this patricide, though he was a reluctant participant, would perhaps haunt him throughout his life, expressed in his lifelong penance of wearing an iron chain around his waist, adding a link each year. This personal act of contrition, a silent burden beneath his royal robes, offers a glimpse into the complex inner world of a king, often described as charismatic and brilliant. His reign began with a concerted effort to unify the kingdom, particularly the Highlands and Islands, which had long resisted central authority. James understood the importance of a strong navy, not just for defence, but for projecting Scottish power and facilitating trade. He invested heavily in shipbuilding, commissioning the construction of the Great Michael in 1507, a massive warship that was, for a time, the largest in Europe. Imagine the awe it must have inspired, its towering masts reaching for the Scottish skies, its formidable cannons, a testament to a nation asserting its place on the world stage. This era also saw the establishment of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh in 1506, a testament to James's interest in science and medicine, reflecting the broader intellectual currents of the Renaissance. But James's ambitions were not solely naval or medical. He was a true Renaissance prince, fluent in several languages, a skilled musician, and a patron of poets and scholars. The court of James IV became a vibrant centre of learning and artistic expression. William Dunbar, one of Scotland's greatest medieval poets, flourished under his patronage, his verses painting vivid pictures of court life, religious devotion, and biting satire. The king himself was a keen astronomer and alchemist, his curiosity extending to the very fabric of the universe. One can almost picture him in his study, surrounded by maps and instruments, his mind grappling with the mysteries of the cosmos, while outside the sounds of lute music and learned discourse drifted through the castle halls. Diplomatically, James IV played a delicate game. His marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, in 1503, was a pivotal moment. This union, celebrated with great pomp and pageantry, was dubbed the Marriage of the Thistle and the Rose, a symbolic attempt to bring peace between the two ancient rivals. The marriage treaty, signed in 1502, seemed to promise a new era of Anglo-Scottish amity, a vision of shared prosperity rather than perpetual conflict. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound cordiality, the deep-seated rivalries and historical grievances continued to simmer. The old alliance with France, a cornerstone of Scottish foreign policy for centuries, remained a powerful counterweight to any rapprochement with England. The peace, fragile as it was, began to fray with the ascension of Henry VIII to the English throne in 1509. Young, ambitious, and eager to make his mark on European politics, Henry soon embarked on a war with France, a move that placed James IV in an unenviable position. His wife was Henry's sister, but his ancestral loyalties and the terms of the Eld Alliance bound him to France. The French king, Louis XII, appealed to James's chivalry and his obligations, sending him a ring and a plea for support. This appeal, a direct challenge to the Anglo-Scottish treaty, was a test of James's resolve. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind James IV's fateful decision to invade England in 1513. Was it a genuine commitment to the Old Alliance, a point of honour he felt compelled to uphold? Was it a strategic miscalculation, an overestimation of Scottish military strength and an underestimation of English resolve? Or was it, as some suggest, a more personal slight, a response to Henry VIII's perceived disrespect and his refusal to hand over a legacy left to his sister Margaret? Whatever the primary driver, the decision set Scotland on a collision course with destiny. The Scottish army, a formidable force, numbering perhaps as many as 30,000 men, crossed the border into Northumberland in August 1513. James IV, leading from the front, captured several border castles, including Norham, a strategically important stronghold. He then established his position on Flodden Edge, a strong defensive ridge, awaiting the English forces. The English army, led by Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, though smaller, was well trained and equipped, and crucially, commanded by experienced veterans of the Continental Wars. The Battle of Flodden, fought on September 9th, 1513, remains one of the most tragic and pivotal events in Scottish history. The Scottish forces, arrayed in traditional schiltrons or pike formations, initially held their ground. However, a combination of factors conspired against them. The English artillery, more advanced and effectively deployed, inflicted heavy casualties. The terrain, made boggy by recent rains, hampered the Scottish advance. And perhaps most critically, James IV's chivalric but ultimately ill-advised decision to lead a charge on foot into the thick of the fighting proved disastrous. The battle descended into a brutal melee. The Scottish pikemen, though brave, were outmaneuvered by the English billmen, whose shorter, more versatile weapons proved superior in close quarters. As the day wore on, the Scottish lines began to break. The flower of Scottish nobility, fighting alongside their king, fell in droves. The legend of the Flowers of the Forest, a lament for the fallen, speaks of the devastating loss. We'll hear nae mair lilting at our ewe milking. Women and bairns are heartless and wae. By the end of that dreadful day, James IV himself lay dead on the field, the last British monarch to die in battle. His body, identified by the iron chain he wore, was found among the heaps of the slain. The scale of the Scottish losses was catastrophic, estimated to be between 10,000 and 17,000 men, including an archbishop, 2 bishops, 11 earls, 15 lords, and numerous chieftains and gentry. Almost every noble family in Scotland suffered a loss. The entire generation of Scotland's leadership was wiped out in a single afternoon. The immediate aftermath of Flodden plunged Scotland into a profound crisis. The heir to the throne, James V, was a mere infant of 17 months, placing the kingdom under a regency. His mother, Margaret Tudor, initially held the regency, but her English origins and subsequent remarriage to Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, created deep divisions and political instability. The ensuing years were marked by factionalism, power struggles among the nobility, and renewed English incursions. The carefully constructed peace and the cultural vibrancy of James IV's reign were shattered, replaced by a period of vulnerability and internal strife. The psychological impact of Flodden on the Scottish psyche was immense and long-lasting. It was a national trauma, a wound that festered for generations. The collective grief and sense of loss permeated Scottish literature and folklore, becoming a defining moment in the nation's identity. The defeat at Flodden highlighted the inherent dangers of the Old Alliance, demonstrating how Scotland could be drawn into larger European conflicts against its own long-term interests. It underscored the precariousness of Scottish independence, constantly overshadowed by its more powerful southern neighbour. Yet, even in the shadow of such a devastating defeat, the spirit of Scotland endured. The kingdom, though weakened, did not collapse. The institutions of government, though strained, continued to function. The cultural seeds sown during James IV's reign, though temporarily overshadowed by conflict, would eventually blossom again. The legacy of Flodden was not just one of loss, but also one of resilience, a testament to a nation's ability to absorb profound blows and still find the strength to rebuild. The reign of James IV, therefore, stands as a poignant chapter in Scottish history. It was a period of brilliant light and profound darkness, of Renaissance ambition and medieval tragedy. The king who fostered art and learning, who built a powerful navy and sought to unify his kingdom, ultimately met his end on a muddy field in Northumberland, his dreams of glory dissolving into the mists of battle. His story is a reminder of the delicate balance between diplomacy and war, between cultural flourishing and political ambition, and how quickly the tides of fortune can turn, leaving behind a legacy of both pride and sorrow. The echoes of Flodden, the mournful strains of the flowers of the forest, would continue to resonate through the glens and across the moors of Scotland for centuries to come. A sombre reminder of the cost of kingship and the enduring spirit of a nation. The early 16th century in Scotland was a time of shifting allegiances and burgeoning change, a period when the old certainties began to fray at the edges, preparing the ground for a dramatic transformation. James V, inheriting a kingdom still reeling from the tragedy of Flodden and the subsequent regencies, sought to reassert the authority of the crown, a task made all the more complex by the ever-present shadow of England to the south and the growing religious unrest within his own borders. Born in 1512, James ascended the throne as an infant, his minority dominated by the struggles between his mother, Margaret Tudor, and various noble factions, including the formidable Earl of Angus. His early years were a crucible of political intrigue, shaping a monarch who would prove both cunning and headstrong. As James matured, he moved decisively to consolidate his power, famously escaping the tutelage of the Douglases in 1528. He then embarked on a determined effort to restore royal prestige and order, often at the expense of his more powerful nobles. He earned the moniker King of the Commons for his perceived sympathy towards the common people and his harsh treatment of those nobles who defied him. His reign was characterized by a blend of ruthlessness and a genuine desire for justice, though his methods could be brutal. He established the College of Justice in 1532, an important step in formalizing the legal system and ensuring greater impartiality, at least in theory. This institution, still a cornerstone of Scottish law today, aimed to provide a more centralized and equitable administration of justice. Moving away from the often arbitrary decisions of local lords, James's foreign policy was largely dictated by the delicate balance between France and England. Following the traditional Old Alliance, he sought to strengthen ties with France, a strategy that culminated in his 2 marriages to French princesses. His first wife, Madeleine of Valois, daughter of King Francis I, brought with her a substantial dowry and the promise of a powerful alliance. But she was sickly and died within months of arriving in Scotland in 1537. Her brief presence, however, was a moment of great celebration, a fleeting burst of French courtly splendour in the Scottish capital. James quickly remarried, choosing Mary of Guise, a woman of formidable intellect and political acumen, from one of France's most powerful noble families. Their marriage in 1538 was a strategic masterstroke, further cementing the French connection and bringing a strong, capable queen to Scotland. Mary of Guise was no mere consort. She quickly adapted to her new home, learning Scots and immersing herself in the kingdom's affairs. Her presence was a significant factor in James's later years, offering counsel and stability. However, the shadow of England loomed large. Henry VIII, James's uncle, was increasingly concerned by Scotland's close ties to France and, more importantly, by the burgeoning Protestant Reformation that was sweeping across Europe. Henry had broken with Rome, establishing the Church of England, and he urged James to follow suit, offering wealth and influence in exchange for abandoning the Catholic Church. James, however, remained steadfastly Catholic, seeing the Church as a crucial ally against the power of his own nobility and a source of significant royal revenue. This religious divide, coupled with Henry's aggressive foreign policy, inevitably led to conflict. Border skirmishes escalated, culminating in the disastrous Battle of Solway Moss in November 1542. The Scottish army, poorly led and demoralised, suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the English. James V, already ill and deeply despondent over the loss of his two infant sons earlier that year, was utterly broken by the news. He retreated to Falkland Palace, where he succumbed to his illness just a few weeks later, on December 14, 1542. He was only 30 years old. His dying words, upon hearing that his wife Mary of Guise had given birth to a daughter, were reportedly, "It came with a lass, and it will pass with a lass," a melancholic reference to the Stuart dynasty's claim to the throne through Marjorie Bruce, daughter of Robert the Bruce. He died without a living male heir, leaving behind his 6-day-old daughter, Mary, to inherit the tumultuous Scottish throne. The death of James V plunged Scotland into another long and fraught regency. Mary of Guise, as the mother of the infant queen, was a natural contender for the regency, but the Scottish Parliament initially appointed James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, as regent. Arran, a Protestant sympathiser, initially pursued a pro-English policy, even agreeing to the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543, which proposed marrying the infant Mary to Henry VIII's son, Edward. This plan, known as the Rough Wooing, aimed to unite the crowns of England and Scotland through marriage, a vision that Henry VIII had long harboured. However, the treaty was deeply unpopular with many Scottish nobles and the Catholic clergy, who feared English domination and the imposition of Protestantism. Mary of Guise, with the support of the Catholic faction and French diplomacy, skillfully undermined Arran's authority. She cultivated alliances among the nobility and leveraged French financial and military aid. The arrival of French troops and the growing anti-English sentiment helped her to consolidate her position. By 1548, Arran had been persuaded to renounce the Treaty of Greenwich and instead agree to send the young Queen Mary to France to be raised at the French court and married to the Dauphin Francis. This decision, a triumph for Mary of Guise, ensured the continuation of the old alliance and placed Scotland firmly in the French orbit. But it also sowed the seeds for future religious and political upheaval. Mary of Guise formally assumed the regency in 1554, replacing Arran, who was compensated with the Duchy of Châtellerault in France. Her regency was marked by a determined effort to strengthen royal power and maintain the Catholic faith. She surrounded herself with French advisors and soldiers, a move that increasingly alienated many Scottish nobles who resented the growing French influence. She also faced the monumental challenge of the burgeoning Protestant movement. The ideas of the Reformation, brought to Scotland by figures like Patrick Hamilton and George Wishart, were gaining traction, particularly among the merchant classes and some of the lesser nobility. The burning of Protestant preachers, such as Wishart in 1546, only served to galvanize the movement and create martyrs. The religious landscape of Scotland was becoming increasingly polarized. The Catholic Church, though still powerful, was plagued by corruption and a lack of effective leadership. Its vast wealth was coveted by many nobles, who saw the Reformation as an opportunity for land and power. The Protestant preachers, often charismatic and eloquent, articulated a theology that resonated with a populace weary of perceived abuses by the established church. John Knox, a fiery and uncompromising reformer, emerged as a leading voice of the Scottish Reformation. After a period of exile, he returned to Scotland in 1559, his sermons igniting the passions of the Protestant lords of the congregation. Mary of Guise, caught between her loyalty to the Catholic Church and her desire to maintain stability for her daughter's kingdom, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She attempted to suppress the Protestant movement through a combination of negotiation and force, but her efforts were met with growing resistance. The lords of the congregation, emboldened by Knox's preaching and receiving clandestine support from England, began to openly defy her authority. They formed a covenant, pledging to defend the Protestant faith, and soon they were raising armies. The conflict escalated into open warfare in 1559. The Lords of the Congregation, with English military and financial aid, openly challenged Mary of Guise's regency. The struggle was not just religious, it was a battle for the political soul of Scotland, a contest between French influence and an emerging Scottish national identity, intertwined with the Protestant cause. Mary of Guise, beleaguered and ill, found herself besieged in Leith by the Protestant forces. Her health rapidly deteriorated, and she died in Edinburgh Castle in June 1560, a few months before her forces were finally defeated. Her death marked a pivotal moment. With the French forces withdrawn and the Protestant lords in control, the Scottish Parliament, in August 1560, formally adopted a Protestant confession of faith and abolished the authority of the Pope in Scotland. This revolutionary act, carried out in the absence of Queen Mary, who was still in France, effectively established Protestantism as the national religion. The old order, which had endured for centuries, was irrevocably shattered. The stage was now set for the dramatic return of Mary, Queen of Scots, to a kingdom transformed by religious fervour and political upheaval. A kingdom poised on the precipice of a new era, where the union of the crowns, once a distant English ambition, would slowly begin to take shape through a complex interplay of dynastic claims, religious strife, and shifting European power dynamics. The ancient echoes of Celtic saints and Roman legions had faded, replaced by the fervent hymns of reformers and the clash of new ideologies, forever altering the destiny of Scotland.